The salt spray stung Christopher Columbus's weathered face as he stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, staring into the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the second day of October, 1492, and his crew was growing restless. Whispers of mutiny had begun to circulate among the sailors, their fears mounting with each passing day that brought no sight of land. Yet Columbus remained steadfast, his conviction unshaken by doubt or desperation. Born in the Republic of Genoa around 1451, Columbus had spent his youth absorbing tales of distant lands and exotic treasures. The Silk Roads that connected Europe to Asia had long been dominated by Ottoman control, making eastern trade routes increasingly perilous and expensive. European merchants desperately sought alternative paths to the riches of the Indies, and Columbus believed he held the key to unlocking this commercial paradise. His radical theory was both simple and revolutionary. The earth was smaller than most scholars believed, and one could reach the Indies by sailing west across the Atlantic. While learned men like Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli had suggested similar ideas, Columbus possessed something his contemporaries lacked: an unshakable determination to transform theory into reality. For years, Columbus had knocked on the doors of European courts, seeking financial backing for his ambitious voyage. The Portuguese crown, despite their maritime expertise, had rejected his proposal. King Henry VII of England showed little interest. The French court proved equally unresponsive. But in Spain, Columbus found unlikely allies in Queen Isabella, the first of Castile, and King Ferdinand and the second of Aragon. The Spanish monarchs had just completed the Reconquista, driving the last Moorish forces from Granada in January of 1492. With newfound unity and confidence, they were ready to challenge Portuguese dominance in exploration and trade. Columbus's proposal offered them a chance to bypass Portuguese control of African trade routes and establish Spain as a major maritime power. On the 3rd of August, 1492, 3 ships departed from Palos de la Frontera: the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niga. The crew of 90 men carried with them the hopes of the Spanish crown and the fears common to all who ventured into uncharted waters. Medieval maps marked the western Atlantic with warnings of sea monsters and the edge of the world itself, as documented in historical accounts preserved in the archive of the Indies in Seville. Columbus maintained meticulous records of his journey, though he often kept a logged one showing the true distance traveled and another, showing shorter distances to prevent his crew from realizing how far they had sailed from home. The voyage tested every man aboard. Food supplies dwindled, and the crew's initial excitement transformed into anxiety, then fear, and finally near rebellion. Columbus faced the ultimate test of leadership, maintaining morale and discipline while navigating into the complete unknown. His ability to inspire confidence, despite mounting evidence that his calculations might be catastrophically wrong, would prove crucial to the success of the expedition. By early October, signs of land began to appear: birds flying overhead, pieces of carved wood floating in the water, and changes in ocean currents. These small indicators rekindled hope in the expedition, setting the stage for a discovery that would fundamentally alter the course of human history and usher in an age of exploration that would reshape the entire world. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 12th of October, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, spotted a white cliff gleaming in the moonlight. His cry of "Tierra, tierra, land, land," echoed across the water, reaching the ears of Columbus and his weary crew. After 36 days at sea, they had finally reached what Columbus believed to be the outer islands of the Indies. As dawn broke, the 3 ships approached what the native Lucayan people called Guanahani, an island Columbus would rename San Salvador. The Europeans gazed in wonder at pristine beaches lined with unfamiliar vegetation and populated by people unlike any they had ever encountered: the indigenous inhabitants. Curious about these strange vessels and pale-skinned visitors gathered along the shoreline to witness this unprecedented meeting of two worlds. Columbus, dressed in his finest scarlet doublet and carrying the royal banner of Castile and Leon, waded ashore with his captains in a ceremony that would be replicated countless times across the Americas. He claimed the land for the Spanish crown, planting the flag and declaring sovereignty over territories that had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The Lucayans, unable to comprehend the legal implications of this ritual, watched with fascination as the strangers performed their mysterious ceremony. The initial encounters between Europeans and the indigenous people were marked by mutual curiosity. and cautious cooperation. Columbus noted in his journal that the natives were very well-built people, with handsome bodies and very fine faces. He observed their generosity, writing that they would trade valuable items for simple trinkets like glass beads and bells. This generosity, however, also convinced him of their vulnerability and potential as subjects of the Spanish crown. Columbus spent several days exploring the Lucayan archipelago, which he called the Indies, convinced he had reached islands off the coast of Asia. He encountered various indigenous groups, including the Taino people, who possessed a complex society with sophisticated agricultural practices, intricate religious beliefs, and extensive trade networks spanning multiple islands. Their peaceful nature and apparent lack of iron weapons reinforced Columbus's belief that these lands could be easily conquered and exploited. The explorer's primary motivation remained commercial. He searched desperately for gold, spices, and other valuable commodities that would justify his expedition to his Spanish sponsors. While he found small amounts of gold ornaments among the natives, the vast treasures he had promised remained elusive. Nevertheless, he collected samples of local plants, captured several indigenous people to bring back to Spain as evidence of his discoveries, and documented his observations of this new world. According to research published in the Journal of World History, Columbus's voyage represented more than just a navigational achievement. It marked the beginning of sustained contact between the old and new worlds, initiating what historian Alfred Crosby would later term the Columbian Exchange. The return journey began on the 15th of January, 1493, but not without drama. The ships encountered severe storms, and Columbus feared his discoveries might be lost forever. If neither vessel survived to carry news back to Europe, the Pinta and the Niga became separated during the tempest, and Columbus worried that Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, might attempt to claim credit for the discoveries. Columbus's arrival in Lisbon on the 4th of March, 1493, created immediate diplomatic tensions. King John II of Portugal initially claimed that the discoveries fell within Portuguese territory under existing papal bulls. However, Columbus's Spanish sponsors moved quickly to legitimize their claims, setting the stage for the Treaty of Tordesillas that would divide the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. The news of Columbus's success spread rapidly through European courts, carried by merchants, diplomats, and travelers who recognized the profound implications of his achievement. The discovery of new lands promised unlimited opportunities for expansion, wealth, and the spread of Christianity, igniting imaginations and ambitions across the continent. Within months of Columbus's triumphant return to the Spanish court in April of 1493, the news of his discoveries had spread like wildfire throughout Europe. Royal courts from Lisbon to London buzzed with excitement and apprehension. As the implications of this remarkable achievement became clear, the age of European exploration was about to explode into unprecedented activity. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand received Columbus with great ceremony in Barcelona, where he presented his evidence of the new lands, exotic birds, strange plants, gold ornaments, and 6 indigenous people he had brought from the islands. The Spanish monarchs, recognizing the immense potential of these discoveries, immediately began planning follow-up expeditions. They also moved swiftly to secure papal approval for their claims to the newly discovered territories. Pope Alexander VI, himself Spanish-born, issued a series of papal bulls in 1493 that granted Spain dominion over the lands Columbus had discovered. The most significant of these, Intercutera, drew an imaginary line 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, granting Spain all lands discovered west of this line. This papal decree, however, failed to satisfy Portugal's King John II, who had his own ambitions for westward expansion. The diplomatic tensions between Spain and Portugal culminated in the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed on the 7th of June, 1494. This agreement moved the line of demarcation to 170 leagues further west, inadvertently granting Portugal future claims to Brazil, while confirming Spanish dominion over most of the Americas. Neither nation realized they were dividing continents whose true extent remained completely unknown. Meanwhile, other European powers watched these developments with growing concern and envy. King Henry VII of England, who had previously rejected Columbus's proposal, now realized his mistake. The English court began seeking their own routes to the riches of the New World, setting the stage for future conflicts over territorial claims and trade routes. In 1497, Henry commissioned John Cabot, a Venetian navigator, to explore the northern Atlantic in search of a passage to Asia. Cabot's voyage from Bristol to what is now Newfoundland marked England's entry into the age of exploration. Though his discoveries initially seemed far less promising than Columbus's, tropical islands with their hints of gold and spices, the French court, under King Charles VIII, also began contemplating westward expansion. French merchants and navigators, previously focused on Mediterranean trade and the continuing conflicts with Italy, started to recognize the commercial potential of transatlantic exploration. This shift in French priorities would eventually lead to expeditions by Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, establishing French claims in North America. The psychological impact of Columbus's success extended far beyond royal courts and merchant houses. Throughout Europe, the discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about geography, theology, and the nature of the world itself. Medieval maps had depicted a world consisting of 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa, surrounded by ocean. Columbus's findings suggested a far more complex and extensive world than anyone had imagined. As referenced in studies from the Newberry Library's collection on Age of Exploration manuscripts, scholars and theologians grappled with profound questions raised by these discoveries. How did these new lands fit into biblical accounts of creation? Were the indigenous peoples descendants of Adam and Eve? Could they be converted to Christianity? These questions would influence European policies toward indigenous populations. For centuries to come, the economic implications proved equally revolutionary. European merchants realized that the monopolistic control exercised by Ottoman and Venetian traders over eastern trade routes could be circumvented through westward expansion. The possibility of accessing Asian spices, silks, and precious metals through Atlantic routes promised to transform European commerce fundamentally. Columbus's success also inspired a generation of navigators, cartographers, and adventurers who saw opportunity in the unknown. Men like Amerigo Vespucci, Vasco Nuez de Balboa, and Hernan Cortez would build upon Columbus's achievement, pushing deeper into the Americas and revealing the true magnitude of the continents he had inadvertently discovered. The age of exploration had truly begun, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity, religious zeal, and an insatiable hunger for wealth and territory that would reshape the entire world. The decade following Columbus's initial voyage witnessed an explosion of maritime expeditions as European powers raced to claim their share of the newly accessible world. Each successful journey inspired additional expeditions, creating a cascade of exploration that would map unknown coastlines and establish trade routes spanning the globe. Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine navigator whose name would eventually grace the continents Columbus had discovered, made his first voyage to the New World in 1499 under the Spanish flag. Unlike Columbus, who maintained until his death that he had reached the Indies, Vespucci recognized that these lands represented an entirely separate continent. His detailed letters describing the geography, flora, fauna, and indigenous peoples of South America circulated widely throughout Europe, contributing to growing awareness that Columbus had discovered something far more significant than a new route to Asia. Vespucci's observations proved particularly influential because of his systematic approach to documentation. He recorded astronomical observations, mapped coastlines with unprecedented accuracy, and provided detailed ethnographic accounts of indigenous cultures. His work convinced many European scholars that they were dealing with a mundus novus, a new world rather than the eastern edges of Asia. Meanwhile, Portuguese navigators, building upon their earlier successes along the African coast, achieved their own breakthrough to the actual Indies. Vasco da Gama's epic voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, reaching Calicut in 1498, proved that a sea route to Asia was indeed possible by sailing east. This achievement intensified the competition between Portugal and Spain, as both nations now possessed viable routes to the world's most lucrative markets. The Spanish, determined to find their own direct route to Asia through the western route Columbus had initiated, sponsored increasingly ambitious expeditions. Vasco Nuez de Balboa's trek across the Isthmus of Panama in 1513 revealed the existence of another vast ocean, the Pacific, demonstrating that the American continents were far wider than anyone had imagined. This discovery proved that Columbus's original goal of reaching Asia by sailing west was theoretically possible, but would require much longer voyages than anticipated. Ferdinand and Magellan, A Portuguese navigator sailing under the Spanish flag finally achieved Columbus's original dream of reaching Asia by sailing west. His expedition, which departed from Spain in 1519, successfully navigated around the southern tip of South America through the treacherous strait that now bears his name, crossed the Pacific Ocean and reached the Philippines, although Magellan died in the Philippines. His surviving crew members completed the first circumnavigation of the globe under Juan Sebastian Elcano, proving definitively that the Earth was round and providing accurate measurements of its true size. The English, not to be outdone, pursued their own path to exploration under the enterprising Cabot family. After John Cabot's initial voyage in 1497, his son Sebastian Cabot continued exploring the North American coast, searching for the elusive Northwest Passage that might provide a shorter route to Asia through the Arctic. While this passage would prove impossible to navigate with 16th century technology, these expeditions established English claims to large portions of North America. French exploration efforts focused on the northern regions of North America, where Jacques Cartier's voyages in the 1530s explored the St. Lawrence River system and established French claims to what would become Canada. Cartier's expeditions, while less immediately profitable than Spanish conquests in Mexico and Peru, laid the foundation for a French colonial empire in North America based on fur trading and missionary activity. As documented in maritime records held at the British National Archives, the rapid expansion of European exploration created increasingly complex diplomatic challenges. Competing claims to newly discovered territories led to conflicts that would persist for centuries, as European powers struggled to reconcile their various papal grants, royal charters, and treaties with the reality of overlapping territorial claims. The technological innovations driven by this age of exploration proved equally significant. Improvements in ship design, navigation instruments, and cartographic techniques made longer voyages more feasible and safer. The development of the galleon, improvements to the compass and astrolabe, and more accurate maps all contributed to the success of subsequent expeditions. Perhaps most importantly, these voyages fundamentally altered European understanding of the world's geography and possibilities. The medieval conception of a small, enclosed world had given way to recognition of vast continents filled with unknown peoples, resources, and opportunities. This expanded worldview would influence European politics, economics, and culture for centuries to come, setting the stage for the colonial empires that would dominate global affairs. Until the 20th century, the success of Columbus's voyages and subsequent explorations created opportunities that attracted a new breed of European adventurer, the conquistadors. These men, driven by dreams of gold, glory, and the spread of Christianity, would transform the initial contact between Europe and the Americas into a systematic conquest that would topple mighty empires and reshape entire continents. Hernan Cortés, a minor nobleman from Extremadura, arrived in the New World seeking his fortune in 1504. By 1519, he had assembled a force of just over 500 Spanish soldiers and set his sights on the Aztec Empire, the most powerful indigenous state in Mesoamerica. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, built on an island in Lake Texcoco, was one of the world's largest cities, with a population exceeding 200,000 inhabitants. The conquest of the Aztec Empire represented far more than a simple military victory. Cortés skillfully exploited existing tensions between the Aztecs and their subject peoples, many of whom had grown resentful of Aztec demands for tribute and human sacrifice. Indigenous groups like the Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztecs, provided crucial military support to the Spanish conquistadors. Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, initially received Cortés as a guest, possibly believing him to be the returning god Quetzalcoatl. This fatal miscalculation allowed the Spanish to establish themselves within the heart of the Aztec capital. When tensions finally erupted into warfare, the Spanish siege of Tenochtitlan lasted for months, ultimately succeeding through a combination of superior military technology, indigenous allies, and the devastating impact of European diseases on the native population. The fall of Tenochtitlan on the 13th of August, 1521, marked the end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of Spanish colonial rule in Mexico. The wealth extracted from the conquered territories, particularly silver from mines like Potosi in present-day Bolivia, would finance Spanish expansion across the globe and fundamentally altered the European economy. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire followed a similar pattern, but proved even more dramatic in its scope and consequences. The Inca Empire, stretching along the western coast of South America from present-day Ecuador to Chile, represented the largest and most sophisticated pre-Columbian state in the Americas. The empire's capital at Cusco served as the center of a complex administrative system that governed millions of subjects across incredibly diverse geographical regions. Pizarro's expedition, beginning in 1532, benefited from timing as much as strategy. The Inca Empire was embroiled in a civil war between two brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, who were fighting for succession to the throne. Pizarro exploited this conflict, initially supporting Atahualpa before ultimately betraying and executing him in 1533. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire at the Battle of Cajamarca demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of European military technology against indigenous forces. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Pizarro commanded fewer than 200 men. Against an Inca army of thousands, the Spanish achieved total victory through superior weapons, armor, and tactics, as well as the psychological impact of horses and firearms on indigenous warriors who had never encountered such technology. As documented in colonial administrative records preserved in the General Archive of the Indies, the wealth extracted from the Americas fundamentally transformed not only Spain, but the entire European economy. The influx of precious metals, particularly silver, led to significant inflation throughout Europe, a phenomenon historians call the price revolution, while simultaneously providing the capital necessary for further expansion and the maintenance of Spain's global empire. The conquistadors' success inspired similar expeditions throughout the Americas. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado explored the American Southwest, searching for the mythical seven cities of gold. Hernando de Soto led an expedition through the southeastern United States, becoming the first European to cross the Mississippi River. These expeditions, while often failing to discover the immediate riches their leaders sought, extended Spanish influence across vast territories and established the foundation for colonial settlements. The conquest period also witnessed the beginning of systematic efforts to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. Spanish missionaries, particularly Franciscans and Dominicans, established missions throughout the conquered territories, attempting to replace indigenous religious practices with Catholic doctrine. This spiritual conquest proved as significant as the military conquest in establishing European dominance over the Americas. The success of the Spanish conquistadors established a template that would be followed by other European powers as they expanded their own colonial empires. The combination of superior military technology, exploitation of indigenous political divisions, and the devastating impact of European diseases on native populations would characterize European expansion throughout the Americas and beyond, fundamentally altering the balance of power between European and indigenous civilizations worldwide. The voyages initiated by Columbus created far more than new trade routes and territorial claims. They established permanent connections between previously isolated continents, triggering what historian Alfred Crosby termed the Columbian Exchange. This massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and cultures between the Old and New Worlds would prove to be one of the most significant developments in human history, affecting populations on every inhabited continent. The biological exchange began immediately with Columbus's first voyage. European ships carried wheat, rice, coffee, sugar cane, horses, cattle, pigs, and chickens to the Americas, while returning to Europe with maize, potatoes, tomatoes, tobacco, cacao, and turkeys. These transfers would revolutionize agriculture and diet on both sides of the Atlantic, supporting population growth and changing culinary traditions that persist to this day. The introduction of European livestock to the Americas had particularly dramatic consequences. Horses, unknown in the New World since the extinction of native species thousands of years earlier, revolutionized transportation and warfare for indigenous peoples. Plains tribes like the Comanche and Lakota would build entire cultures around horse-based hunting and warfare, while Spanish colonists used horses to establish vast cattle ranches across Mexico and South America. European crops transformed American agriculture, but American crops had an even more profound impact on the Old World. The potato, originally cultivated in the Andes, became a staple food in Ireland and Northern Europe, supporting significant population growth. Maize provided high-yield nutrition across Africa and Asia. These American crops helped fuel the population explosion that would characterize the early modern period in Europe and beyond. However, the most devastating aspect of the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of diseases. Indigenous American populations, isolated from Old World disease pools for thousands of years, possessed no immunity to smallpox, measles, typhus, and other European diseases. Epidemics swept through indigenous communities with catastrophic results, often preceding direct European contact and decimating populations. Before military conquest even began, the demographic catastrophe in the Americas was unprecedented. In human history, conservative estimates suggest that indigenous populations declined by 90% within a century of European contact, from perhaps 50 million to 5 million people. Entire civilizations disappeared, taking with them languages, knowledge systems, and cultural traditions accumulated over millennia. This demographic collapse made European conquest far easier than it otherwise would have been and created a labor shortage that would drive the Atlantic slave trade. The demand for labor in American plantations and mines led to the forced migration of millions of Africans to the New World. The Atlantic slave trade, which would transport an estimated 12 million Africans to the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries, represented another crucial component of the Columbian Exchange. This forced migration created new African diaspora communities throughout the Americas, while devastating West and Central African societies. According to research published in the Economic History Review, the economic implications of the Columbian Exchange extended far beyond the immediate participants. The wealth flowing from American mines and plantations financed European expansion into Asia and Africa, while American crops helped sustain population growth in China and India. The global circulation of silver mined in the Americas integrated regional economies into the first truly worldwide economic system. The cultural exchange proved equally significant. European languages, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, became dominant in most of the Americas, while indigenous influences shaped colonial architecture, art, and cuisine. The fusion of European, indigenous, and African cultures created entirely new societies throughout the colonial Americas. From the mestizo populations of Mexico and Peru to the unique Creole cultures of the Caribbean. Religious transformation accompanied cultural change as Catholic missionaries worked to convert indigenous populations throughout the Americas. While European Christianity became dominant, indigenous religious practices often persisted in modified forms, creating syncretic belief systems that combined Christian and native elements. These religious fusions would characterize Latin American Catholicism for centuries. The Columbian Exchange also accelerated technological transfer and innovation. European metallurgy and gunpowder technology spread to the Americas, while indigenous knowledge of local plants and environments proved invaluable to European colonists. The exchange of navigational knowledge and shipbuilding techniques improved maritime technology globally. Environmental consequences of the Columbian Exchange continued to affect ecosystems worldwide. Introduced species often became invasive, altering local environments in ways that persist today. European grazing animals transformed American grasslands, while American crops changed agricultural landscapes across the Old World. These ecological changes represent perhaps the most permanent legacy of Columbus's voyages, affecting the planet in ways that remain visible centuries later. By the mid-16th century, the world Columbus had set in motion through his fateful voyage bore little resemblance to the medieval world he had left behind in 1492. The age of exploration he initiated had fundamentally transformed global politics, economics, and culture, establishing patterns of interaction between continents that would shape world history for centuries to come. The Spanish Empire, built upon the foundation of Columbus's discoveries, had become the first truly global empire in human history. Spanish territory stretched from the Philippines and Asia to Peru in South America, connected by treasure fleets that carried American silver across both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. The Spanish dollar, minted from American silver, became the world's first global currency, accepted in markets from Manila to Amsterdam to Istanbul. The success of Spanish expansion inspired other European powers to establish their own colonial empires. The Portuguese consolidated their control over Brazil, while maintaining their profitable empire in Asia and Africa. The Dutch, achieving independence from Spanish rule, established the Dutch East India Company and built a commercial empire focused On Indonesia and the Indian Ocean trade, the English and French, initially slower to establish overseas territories, began building the colonial empires that would eventually surpass Spanish dominance. The economic transformation initiated by Columbus's voyages fundamentally altered European society. The influx of American wealth fueled the rise of capitalism and banking, while new crops from the Americas supported population growth that provided labor for emerging industries. European cities expanded rapidly, and a new merchant class accumulated wealth that rivaled traditional nobility. The medieval feudal system, already under pressure, gave way to more modern forms of economic and political organization. Technological advancement accelerated dramatically during this period, driven by the practical needs of long-distance navigation and colonial administration. Improvements in shipbuilding, navigation instruments, and cartography made increasingly ambitious voyages possible. The printing press disseminated knowledge of new discoveries throughout Europe, while advances in metallurgy and firearms technology gave Europeans decisive military advantages over most indigenous populations they encountered. The intellectual revolution sparked by Columbus's discoveries proved equally significant. The revelation that classical and medieval authorities had been fundamentally wrong about the world's geography encouraged European thinkers to question other traditional assumptions. This skeptical attitude would contribute to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, as European intellectuals increasingly relied on observation and experimentation rather than ancient authorities. Religious transformation accompanied intellectual change, while Catholic missionaries worked to spread Christianity throughout the Americas. The Protestant Reformation was simultaneously dividing European Christianity. The competition between Catholic and Protestant powers added religious dimensions to colonial rivalries, while exposure to indigenous American religions and increasing knowledge of Asian belief systems challenged European assumptions about religious truth. The social consequences of the age of exploration extended throughout European society. Younger sons of noble families, previously limited to careers in the church or military service, found new opportunities for advancement in colonial administration or overseas trade. The traditional social hierarchy faced challenges from newly wealthy merchants and successful colonial administrators who purchased titles and estates with their American fortunes, as referenced in demographic studies conducted by Cambridge University's Historical Research Department. The global population dynamics set in motion by Columbus's voyages created lasting patterns that persist today. The demographic catastrophe among indigenous Americans was counterbalanced by European population growth supported by American crops and African population displacement through the slave trade. These population movements created the ethnic and cultural diversity that characterizes the modern Americas. The environmental impact of the Columbian Exchange established the first global ecosystem, as plants, animals, and diseases move between continents on an unprecedented scale. This biological globalization created the foundations for modern agriculture, while simultaneously causing ecological disruptions that continue to affect environments worldwide. The introduction of invasive species and the transformation of landscapes through European agricultural practices represent permanent changes to the planet's ecology. The political legacy of Columbus's voyages established the principles that would govern international relations for centuries. The concept of territorial sovereignty over distant lands, the use of technological superiority to justify conquest, and the exploitation of natural and human resources in colonial territories became standard practices for European powers. These patterns would influence global politics well into the 20th century. The age of exploration, initiated by Columbus's courage and determination, had transformed a world of isolated continents into an interconnected global system. Trade routes now span the globe, linking markets in Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Cultural exchange, while often imposed through conquest and colonization, created new synthetic societies throughout the colonial world. The modern world system of capitalism, colonialism, and cultural exchange had been born from the bold decision of a Genos navigator to sail west into the unknown Atlantic Ocean. In 1492, Columbus's legacy extends far beyond his personal achievements as an explorer. His voyages initiated 5 centuries of globalization that continue to shape our interconnected world today. The patterns of global trade, cultural exchange, and international relations established during the age of exploration remain fundamental features of modern civilization, making Columbus's journey one of the most consequential events in human history.